Hi folks, and welcome to the final lecture on Sorry to Bother You and Comolli and Narboni's essay. This is going to be fairly brief. It's just a series of observations, ways to think about the film and the text together. Remember last time we looked at category B, in which both form and content are radical. But let's look at that second part of B about form. Remember that Comolli and Narboni say, this act only becomes politically effective if it is linked with a breaking down of the traditional way of depicting reality. We would stress that only action on both fronts, signified and signifier, has any hope of operating against the prevailing ideology. Economic/political and formal action have to be indissolubly wedded. So let's briefly ask that question. How would we ask that question? Does Sorry to Bother You break down the traditional way of representing reality? What ways does it do so? What ways does it not do so? Well, a number of you talked about this, and I think you have the right idea, talking about the kind of what's been called the popular surrealism of the film. For example, the way it blends interiority and exteriority in ways that are not just conventional with respect to the way cinema can, say, show us the contents of someone's mind. But notice importantly that when Cash, as a telemarketer, feels as if he's entering the homes of the people he's calling, he seems to acknowledge that something is happening when his desk is rumbling, right? The film wants to tear at those conventions that keep interiority and exteriority separate. Also the kind of imaginative representations, the kind of special effects that happen when we have commodities emerge cocoon-like from the shells of their older, more dilapidated versions. Elements of fantasy, such as the costumes involved for the horse people. And most significantly, I think, and this is, I won't say much about it, but I'll just offer this as a question to think about, the element of fantasy plus, I think, the medium reflexivity that comes with the presentation of the white voice. One reason I think the white voice is not merely an element of fantasy, that is something that is clearly not real or realistic, that blends into the diegetic possibilities of the film, is that the dubbing of white actors' voices in this film might be seen to acknowledge the fundamental flexibility of the relationship between image and sound in sound cinema. One of the things I thought that was missing from Baudry's apparatus reflection was in fact a reflection upon the way in which sound cinema is fundamentally an illusion that in his terms is using continuity to pave over the actuality of discontinuity. The fact that image and sound come from distinct technological sources, and that synchronization is an illusion that maps them onto each other. What this film does is it partly exposes that illusion when we have a clear representation of dubbing. So those are some micro elements that might be understood as going against an ordinary depiction of reality. But how is this film classical in terms of how it tells its story? I want us to think a little bit about Baudry here, and in some ways to think about Mulvey for next week. Recall Baudry's interest in what he thinks all Hollywood films tend to do, which is give us camera movement, give us continuity editing, and give us those things in the service of classical narrative continuity. Remember that Baudry thinks these things are in some sense illusory, that they give us an impression of a coherent reality, and they give us the impression that we as spectators are responsible for synthesizing that coherent reality. And in a class like Intro Film in Cinema 121, we would kind of boil down the main traits of classical Hollywood narrative in these ordinary ways. And I think in many ways we can think of the film Sorry to Bother You as fulfilling these traits. Cash, by my estimation, is a very well-rounded character. The film begins by investigating his deepest fears and desires, and the events that start the film are a representation of him trying to achieve those desires and avoid those fears. And this immediately funnels into the fact that the film is very much about Cash's desire to achieve his goals. It's a kind of hero's journey of a film, in which Cash is summoned into a realm that he did not know existed, a kind of underworld, or in this case, a world that ascends above the normative world that he's used to. And one of the most strikingly classical aspects of this plot structure is that his journey through his own personal goals is mapped onto a relationship, a romantic relationship. As he descends into capitalism, he loses his relationship, and as he kind of discovers the problem with it, the relationship comes back together. The other traits I might just leave up here for you to think about. To what degree is Cash a character who is the prime causal agency, and to what degree is causality the thing that gets us from point A to B to C? And does the film have a decisive victory or a defeat? After all, it's a film that has two endings, one that seems a bit more classical than the one that happens right after the final beat of the film. So this should at least make us ask the question, are some elements of Sorry to Bother You better suited for category D than category B? Which is those films, increasingly numerous today, they say, which have an explicitly political content, just like this film does, but which do not effectively criticize the ideological system in which they are embedded because they unquestionably adopt its language and its imagery. Do they express, reinforce, strengthen the very thing they set out to denounce? Are they caught in the system they wish to break down? One of the film's most interesting strategies to argue against this accusation that the film is merely political in content but is too classical in form to achieve the radical work it seems to set out to do is the film's reflexivity. We might ask the question, but what if the film is sufficiently reflexive upon the inefficacy of entertainment or art to cause political change? We talked about this in class, and I think in a really productive way. So I just want to remind folks about all the ways in which this film reflects upon political art with a kind of criticism or critique attached to it. Cash acknowledges, as Detroit does, the fact that the art world is dependent upon bougie, rich art people. At some points in the narrative, Detroit seems to believe in the efficacy of her art as analogous to the efficacy of Squeeze's unionizing practices. He says, trouble's already there, I'm just trying to help folks fix it. She says, yeah, that's what I do with my art, you know. But of course, the moment we actually see a show of Detroit, I think the film is trying to emphasize all the ways in which a kind of artificiality, a falseness, pervades her art practice. The first and most ironic of which is the fact that she uses a white voice while speaking in her artist persona. Or at least this is what I interpret the film trying to do when she adopts a British accent that is not natural to her. And the content of the show itself seems more like a parody of radical performance art pieces like Yoko Ono's Cut piece, in which people in the audience would participate by cutting bits of her clothing, or Marina Abramovich's Rhythm O. And interestingly, the contents of her performance, such as making it clear that cell phones can only work with the mineral coltan, which is a mineral that has caused a lot of strife and war, does in some ways resonate with what the film is trying to do in critiquing, or at least bringing to mind, the actuality of cell phone production in factories. He says, I'm calling about who is assembling your phone, which of course I think the film is trying to make us think about the literal worry-free factories like the Foxconn factory in Shenzhen, which is the world's largest electronics manufacturing company that has installed on the side of its building nets to prevent suicides. And a more subtle but equally cutting and I think maybe deep critique of the capacity for art to trigger or catalyze social and political change is this gag with the horse sculpture. And I think it poses the question, how distant should representation be from reality in trying to represent a kind of political problem? How distant should our allegories be? If this film is an allegory, in some sense, if it means to stand in for the world that we occupy, was it a good choice to take that leap into the sci-fi dystopian with the Equisapiens? As this person is looking at this work of protest art, which says literally worry-free is turning workers into horses, he asks, maybe it's saying that capitalism dehumanizes people by turning into horses? And this is posed as a joke, but I think a really interesting one. If we think of art as distinct from journalism, that it is not reportage, would it be more useful to simply have this message be attached to a news article than be attached to a sculpture that people want to interpret in these allegorical ways? And on the other side of things, if art is critiqued, in some sense, protest is critiqued, or what can happen to protest in a world that wants to commodify and capitalize on everything. So the have a cola and smile moment gets turned into a huge commodification, an advertisement for the very cola brand that struck a scab in the name of unionizing efforts. More directly, is this brief gag a piece of street art that modified a worry-free billboard, which then we see later at Steve Lift's mansion? And not quite as a way of hiding it, but as a way of displaying it. Notice the nice touch of the velvet rope around it. And finally, the final gag, which is if you watch to the credits, the end of the film says that the film itself is a copyrighted object of Worry Free Incorporated, almost suggesting that if Worry Free existed, the kind of movie that it might make to capitalize on a popular leftism might be a movie like Sorry to Bother You. So I want to end here and just leave you with these observations and a set of questions for how to kind of think about this film with respect to Comolli and Narboni's categories, and how we might juxtapose this film with other films in this class. All right, thanks.